Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Today we have SQL Perform, and they are going to be presenting on Dynamics NAV and SQL Server Performance Tuning. And presenting is Floyd Chan. And we just ask that if you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to type them into the questions box, and we will get them called out toward the end of the webinar. And we do record all of our webinars, so this will be available for you to review again, or if you'd like to share it with anyone who may be interested, that will be on our website at innovia.com later this week. So now I'll turn it over to Floyd, and he will begin our presentation.
All right, Angie, thank you very much. Just making sure audio is okay. It seems like it's still up, so perfect. All right, thank you everybody for spending some time with us and getting to know us and our product. We're going to spend the next hour talking a little bit about one of our services at the very least, and focusing on Dynamics NAV and SQL Server Performance. So let's get the ball rolling. First, a little bit about SQL Perform. To understand the history of SQL Perform and the lineage that is here, first of all, I'll introduce myself. So I'm Floyd Chan. I am the president of SQL Perform North America. We actually have many branches throughout the world, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. And I've been working with Dynamics NAV now for 20 years, believe it or not. Started in 1998, starting with version 2. And I probably implemented one of the very first NAV on SQL Server implementations in North America. And it was a very interesting and challenging project, simply because at the time, Microsoft had said that implementing Dynamics NAV on SQL Server was very simple to do and very scalable and very good. But me as an implementer at the time discovered it wasn't quite that easy, and I became a reluctant SQL Server DBA and specialized in that aspect of NAV and SQL Server. Now, I'm going to put my story off to the side for a moment, and I'm going to introduce you to another character in our story, Hinek Mulbacher. So Hinek used to be a Microsoft, well, actually I'll back up a step. Hinek used to be a Dynamics NAV developer for NAV. Back in the day when it was still called Navision, he started in 1993. So he's been at it for a very, very long time. And Hinek is based out of originally the UK. And he was deeply involved with product development with the original Navision company. And in roughly 1998 or so, when Navision knew that they were likely going to be acquired by Microsoft, and to make it a little bit more enticing, back in the day, Navision, as it was called, only ran on a proprietary database engine, which probably some of you know or might not know. And at that time, Navision, the company based out of Denmark, made a decision to add SQL Server as an option for a database on the back end. And largely because Microsoft runs on SQL Server and therefore makes the product much more interesting to Microsoft. And Hinek, being one of the developers, was deeply involved with some of that development and migration towards taking NAV and implementing on SQL Server. And as we all know, shortly after 2001 or so, Microsoft actually did acquire Navision, and it became a Microsoft product, and SQL Server was a component, and still is a component, a key component of what was then called Navision, now Dynamics NAV. And Hinek at that point became a Microsoft employee, still working with Microsoft internally on the Navision product, and also focusing on the SQL Server component of it. And in fact, internally, he was the go-to guy for Microsoft and SQL Server, among other people within the group. In 2003, Hinek decided to take his methodologies and tools around NAV and SQL Server and start up an independent company. And this is when SQL Perform UK was formed. all right? And Hynek was our principal, still is. And in 2006 or so, he and I crossed paths, and we realized we were doing a lot of things that were very similar, and he asked me to represent the North American branch of SQL Perform, and that's how we came to be. So currently SQL Perform, we do have branches all over the world, as I mentioned. We representing the North American branch, Hynek having the UK branch. We also have locations in Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. And these are some of the largest NAV market shares in the world in terms of customer base and installations. All right. And our company, SQL Perform, has also been involved deeply with Microsoft throughout product development over the years as they move forward in developing the product and also providing information and guidance as to how NAV and SQL Server can work better. So that's a little bit about us. Let's move on here. Let's now start focusing about the actual product itself and SQL Server. So to understand NAV and SQL Server performance, first of all, I'm going to, for the sake of this presentation, I'm going to focus on-premise hardware. Cloud and virtualization is very similar, but it does add additional layers of complexity and understanding, but we'll keep it simple for the purpose of this conversation. If anybody wants to talk to me further about the cases of virtualization and cloud and other kinds of deployments, that's not a problem, but we'll start with the basics first. So when we talk about NAV and SQL Server performance, what I always like to say is that performance for NAV is like a pyramid. All right, and that is like a pyramid, you have to have a solid base to build upon so that the end user at the apex of that pyramid is going to be able to visualize good performance. All right, so what's within this pyramid? What's in this stack that goes from the bottom up? Well, down at the very bottom, underlying the pyramid, of course, is your networking, your infrastructure setup in terms of your domain, etc. But on top of that basic layer, what you'll probably have is your physical SQL Server hardware, right? And tied to that is some sort of data storage component, perhaps a SAN or some SSDs or some other types of components, depending on how you've chosen to deploy. On top of that, then you would deploy SQL Server itself. Okay, so this is the application. And then on top of SQL Server, you would have the SQL Server databases that are standard, master, model, tempdb, for example, and a few others, depending on how you've got it configured. And this entire layer, I like to refer to it as the SQL Server configuration layer. Okay, so it's all about what are all the different parameters that you put into place and how did you set this all up and interconnect it all in order to get it working. And as you can see, this is the lower part of my pyramid. As I work up the pyramid towards the end user, within SQL Server, we also have the NAV database itself. Within that, we also have indexes, SIFT, and other components that are very specific to NAV that make it work well. All right, but they're all part of components that live inside the SQL Server NAV database. And as part of this, what we'll see potentially is locks, blocks, and deadlocks. So we'll talk about that in just a moment as well. All right, so we were talking about this layer where we have locks, blocks, and deadlocks. This layer, what I like to refer to is the NAV database configuration layer. So this is the settings that you set up on the SQL Server backend, specifically around NAV. And this layer might be a little different than the way you might specify some databases for other applications. So this is an application-specific set of configurations for the NAV SQL Server database. As we work further up into towards the end user again, within NAV, you also have the setups, right? All the different things that you can configure from within the application. Okay, so think of your GL setup, sales and receivable setup, etc. All of these could actually have impact on performance. We also have CalCode. So how is the code written and how efficient is it? And perhaps whether or not it's been customized or not could also have impact. And of course, once all of this code is being executed, what happens is the NAV application will generate SQL queries that get sent to the SQL server and actually be acted upon. So this upper layer is what I call the NAV application configuration and design layer. So that's all towards the end user. So this is the entire stack of different components that are actually being used as NAV runs. All right. So now, from an end user perspective who's up at the apex here and perceives performance through this entire stack of components, right? You can now see that all these things are very, very important. So first off, my general question typically I ask people about performance is, what is good performance? Right? That's actually a very important question to ask yourself as you're thinking about your environment. What is good performance? And often I'm given a technical answer. You know, it's when there's so many transactions that can occur on the SQL Server backend, so many ins and outs, I/O operations per second, number of locks per second, however you want to measure it. Okay, I get these different kinds of answers quite often. I actually would typically like to say good performance is when the end user can say, I get to go home early. So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is performance is a perception thing, right? And performance is perceived by the end user. And the point is, whether the system actually is performing well or not, is the end user needs to perceive it. And therefore, if the perception is that it's moving fast, then the performance is good. I'll give a really good example. For example, you have a very long running warehouse process that runs overnight. And you run it as a batch job, just so that perhaps, you know, it's to update warehouse entries or something. And it starts at midnight, typically finishes at 6 a.m. And maybe the code in this function is actually very inefficient, and that's why it takes 6 hours to run. But because it finishes before anyone shows up in the morning, no one cares about the performance of that component. Of course, as long as it doesn't impact anything else. But the point is, if it isn't perceived, it is not bad performance, right? If that thing ran during the day and it interfered with people, then absolutely, then the perception is bad performance. So ultimately, the point I'm making here is I tend to guide people to look at users, when I say people, users and owners of the NAV system, to look at the end user's perspective, all right, and understand whether or not they feel that something is slow or not. That's what you need to focus on. Sometimes I get calls from IT companies and they want me to focus on certain processes, but in fact, those processes, as I pointed out, they're not perceived by anyone. So therefore, are you really focusing on something that provides value, right? So perhaps technically, great, you've sped it up, but if nobody is perceiving a performance impact, then maybe there's no real value here, right? So whenever you look at performance, ask yourself, is anyone perceiving this as a problem? And if there is a perception, what is the perception? What is the problem? Okay, so having said all that, this performance stack, the other thing that goes on here as end users interact with the NAV system, and basically cal code is being called, they're being turned into transact SQL statements, and as the statements are being generated and they're passed to SQL Server, it generates these locks, blocks, and potentially deadlocks. All right. So the other thing I want to make clear for those who perhaps are not very technical on the call is to understand that locks, blocks, and deadlocks are natural. SQL Server has to create locks and blocks as it is creating queries to get data, and especially when it's writing data or changing data in SQL Server. So these things are natural. These things are created, locks, blocks, and potentially deadlocks. These are all natural effects to guarantee that the data that's being written to SQL Server is going to be written cleanly and being written in such a way that no one else can interfere with that change to SQL Server as it's occurring, so that it will create consistent data. So locks, blocks, and potentially even deadlocks are natural. What is the issue potentially is when a lock, block, or potentially deadlock takes too long to resolve. That is truly the problem. That's when the perception sometimes also is that it takes too long. All right. So ultimately, the end user at the top could see performance issues in any one of these components. But I just want to make sure that quite often people also think that locks, blocks, and deadlocks are necessarily a bad thing, and I just want to point out that it is not necessarily a bad thing. Locks, blocks, and deadlocks are natural, but we want them to be as quick as possible. All right, so now that you understand this stack, this generalized view of end users working with SQL Server and hardware, what we typically do or see as SQL Perform as we're helping clients resolve performance issues is we typically see that in probably 80% of the cases that are out there, most problems tend to be in the lower portions of this pyramid, right? So therefore, you know, we typically like to approach performance issues with clients where we prefer to try to look from the bottom up and resolve from the bottom up. Again, from that perspective of we want to make sure that the base of the pyramid is solid before we try to tackle problems further up. Okay, so because of that approach, what we like to do is offer a service. So we'll talk about the first service that we've got here, our offering. And in this case, it's something that we call the NAV Performance Audit Report. Okay, so this is a document that we create in order to look at basically the lower 80% of this stack, right? And notice, by the way, we do not look at the setups or cal code directly as part of this service, although I'll talk about that a little bit so you can understand what does that mean and why that would be. All right, so let's talk a little bit about this NAV Performance Audit Report. Now, prior to being able to jump into the report itself, I'm now going to introduce you to our performance tools that we use in order to do some of this work, right? So these are tools. You may remember I mentioned Hinek Molbacher. He developed these tools for the performance area of our company to be able to look at NAV and measure different responses, as well as perhaps to work with NAV and SQL Server to configure it better for performance. So let me talk about these three tools. So the tools are SQL Server stored procedures. They all run on the SQL Server back end, and they are sold on subscription basis. So basically you would buy a subscription for the year and you would renew on an annual basis, and we would send you an updated license each year so that you can continue using the tools. And currently on the Perform tools side of our family, so we have two families of tools. One is called Perform tools. The other one is called our archiving and compression tools that we'll talk about on another presentation, but today we're focused on performance. Within the Perform tool set, we have three sets of tools. One is called Perform Analysis, which is required in order to do the audit. So the Perform Analysis tools, SQL Store procedures that can be used on SQL Server. They're run as queries, and you can use these at any point in time to run in SQL Server in order to ask questions of SQL Server in terms of how's the system currently behaving, what is it doing, and also to be able to record some of the actual KPIs of the system. right? And be able to record some of the behaviors. So this particular tool set we use in order to gather data in order to create the report. This is the reason why this tool set is required as part of the performance audit report service. So one set of tools plus the actual service of creating the report. Perform maintenance is an optional tool set. Quite often our clients will buy all three tools. In this case, the Perform maintenance tool set is a set of SQL store procedures, once again. Unlike the Perform analysis tools, which if you want to think of them this way, they're reactive tools. They're tools that you can use at any point in time and run them against SQL Server to say what's happening right now. Perform maintenance is about ongoing, okay? So ongoing maintenance and performance. So these are SQL store procedures, commands, which you can then embed into SQL jobs. And perhaps you might have jobs that run nightly, daily, maybe once a week, once a month, whatever the case. And these tools can help you maintain your NAV SQL Server database better. It'll do things like help you with indexes, statistics, and a bunch of other things that, if you're interested, we can provide additional materials on. The last tool set is the Perform tracking tools, and these are proactive tools. So basically what these do is take advantage of something in SQL Server called database mail, built into SQL servers, the ability to send out emails or SMS messages. And what our Perform tracking tools do is you can set up KPIs and thresholds so that based on what you want to do and what you might want to watch and be aware of, is to set these thresholds for things like, when a database reaches a certain size, you might want a warning to say, hey, it's time to think about growing my database as part of a maintenance downtime. And therefore, by getting the warning in advance, I can schedule that so that it doesn't interfere with production hours. Right? So these are the three tool sets that we offer. And again, Perform analysis is required as part of the performance audit. Let me continue talking about the audit. So the way the audit works is once the Perform tools are acquired, what we would do is we would get remote access to your SQL Server. You would give us basically super access, in this case SA within SQL Server or something equivalent. And we would go into the SQL Server remotely and we would install the tools. They go in quite quickly and we turn them on. And what they do, as I said, is as part of the tool set, is they will record performance into a bunch of SQL tables and start acquiring a whole bunch of data points into these tables. Typically, what we like to do is run the tools over 2 business weeks, all right? And it's up to you. We have run the tools over a shorter time frame and gather less data in order to try to get things done sooner if you are in a situation where perhaps your system is quite critical and you're in a lot of pain, perhaps we might cut it down. But usually 2 weeks is a really good time frame in order to capture all of the different kinds of general business transactions that all of your users would be doing, so that we can get a really good holistic view of what's going on. And that is backing up at highest level, and I should have probably said this earlier, that is really what the purpose of the performance audit is about. It's to really get information at a holistic level across your entire environment, okay? So that we can understand all those different layers of components in that performance stack, so that when we generate the report, we can then make better recommendations as to potentially what to prioritize to look at. So let's continue here in terms of this slide. At the end of the 14 days, we'll go back remotely again, access those SQL Server tables that were tracking the performance data points. And what we'll do is we'll export that data set and we'll transfer it back to ourselves at our location here. And what we will do is we will analyze it, all right? There's one more bullet point here. We may also take a peek around in your SQL Server, maybe in your NAV setup, just to see how some of that configuration stuff might have been done in the system. So as we're retrieving the data, just to verify, some of the settings. Once we have all the data brought back to ourselves, then we will digest it, all right, and we'll write it up. And it typically takes us about 3 to 5 business days. And once we have the report done, the reports these days, in general, have been clocking in at about 100 to 150 pages long. So you can imagine we go through a lot of stuff. Okay, and in that report could be anything from looking at, again, thinking that stack from the ground up, anything from, how's your disk responses, how is SQL Server configured, how is the machines in terms of RAM or CPU. We will also look at things, queries that were generated from NAV to SQL Server over the 2-week span. And what we'll do is we'll prioritize the top 20 worst performing queries. And because we understand what the SQL Server queries are and how they get generated from NAV, although we're not looking at the NAV code as part of this exercise, we can typically reverse engineer what kind of NAV code would have generated a specific SQL Server statement. So quite often as part of our recommendations as we're looking at queries, we could say, well, this was a very poor performing query. This is probably the kind of SQL Server statement and code that generated it. And when we generate that statement and we give it back to the clients and to the partners involved, quite often we find they can home in on the exact process because it looks very familiar, and they go in and fix it based on our recommendations. So when that report is created, we give it back to you, the client, and what we would like to do is set up a follow-up call. So give you a few days to digest all the information that we've given you. In the report, yes, we do make an executive summary of all the data points and all the discoveries that we come up with. And in that executive summary, so it's like a 1 or 2 pager, what we do is we actually prioritize what we feel are the things that would give you the most important or highest performance gains first. And therefore, it might be things like you need a better data storage component, and it might need to be configured better, or some code might need to be rewritten, or some indexes might need to be turned on or turned off even potentially. And we'll make a list of all these things based on our experience and what we think is the priority of what you need to do. Now, even though we make this list in a performance priority order, that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to execute on it. We're just calling it out to say that this probably makes sense if you can do it in this order, but sometimes companies have different priorities. So perhaps, budget-wise, you can't afford to acquire that kind of hardware currently, or because of timing or other project commitments or other strategic decisions, perhaps making certain kind of changes don't make sense. And that's okay. The point is, at least you're aware, and that you can make a decision to say, yes, we're going to act on this, or no, we're not going to act on it, but at least we're aware of what the impact of that could be. So all of this is discussed as part of a follow-up call. And we will usually spend about 2 hours going through our entire report with your key users so that everyone understands what is in the report and why are we making the recommendations, and what we uncovered and what we think it needs. And at the end of the call, we will then ask the question, what would you like to do next? Because the purpose of the report primarily is look, no touch. We really want to set a benchmark baseline to say, here's what you have, here's what we think you can do holistically to fix things. And based on this, how do you want to divvy up the work? So quite often the clients and their partners take on a very large chunk of the work and they go and resolve things. Sometimes based on the partner involved and the customers involved and perhaps your IT department, your partner and or we may get involved if you wish to engage us in order to provide some services. We can also do that as well. But it's really all dependent on how you would like to tackle the recommendations, right? Now, the wonderful story that I have with this audit report is that for all the, we've probably done several hundred of these reports now, I would say that, as I said, probably 80 or 90% of the cases, clients don't come back to us. Quite often they implement our changes, things are good, and that's the end of it, which is great, right? So given a choice, in most scenarios where clients can go down this road in terms of trying to do a benchmark first, I do recommend this as a very good starting point to understand what's going on in your environment and where to look, all right? Now, that's not to say, though, perhaps, quite often I use the analogy of a hospital emergency room when a client comes to us. Sometimes when that person shows up in our emergency room, they can afford, the time for us to go through all of these diagnostics and we're going to send you in for x-rays and the MRI and all that stuff. And once we get all the information, then we're going to step back, look at all of it and come to a better conclusion to what's going on and make recommendations from it. That's the analogy here for this report. But there are some cases where, somebody shows up in an emergency room and literally we have to wheel them into the operating room and start work, okay? And for that scenario, we're also going to talk about our next service, all right? So if you have any questions, once again, just hold on to them, write them down, and I'll answer questions about the audit and audit report shortly. Let me go to the next service that we also offer. Okay, so back to the NAV Performance Audit Report, just to call out once again, we focus on the lower 89% of the application. And as I said, we don't actually look at the code itself, right? And most of the times we can perform the audit report, and most of the times we find that this resolves most issues for most people. Now, that's not to say that perhaps the issue truly is hiding up in the code, okay? And therefore, you have a scenario of inefficient code. And it might be just simply not written well, or indexes aren't implemented well, or sometimes even though things might have been done properly, over time the nature of your business has changed, and therefore the way you use the system has changed, and therefore the code is not as efficient for your new processes or a higher volume of processes as well, right? So these are possible scenarios why the performance audit report may not hit on a solution. But typically, as I said, I would still recommend that you do the performance audit report first, apply all the recommendations that we make so that we know that the base of this pyramid is fairly solid. Therefore, any remaining issues, we can then focus on this upper portion. And that's where we're going to go next. So what do we do in those remaining cases? We actually have a different service that we offer. By the way, I should point out the NAV Performance Audit Report, we offer it as a fixed price, okay? So basically, it's a single price. We go, do the work for you, deliver the report, go through the follow-up call, handle all your questions, and basically help you figure out next steps wherever necessary, okay? The application tuning service for those remaining cases, or in those cases where I was talking about the escalated scenario where, you know what, can't do the performance audit report, simply it's too much of a problem, perhaps then we need to jump right to application tuning. So let's talk about this. Application tuning, by the way, is time and material, okay? And therefore, it's all dependent on how complicated the scenario is and how much effort it requires. So let's talk a little bit about how this works and how do we control it, because as you can imagine, it can be a scenario where it's very easy for, if you don't have controls, for it to spin out of control from a cost perspective and control perspective. So let's talk about how that works. So typically what we do is we'll sit down with the client and we'll say, give us your top performance bottleneck. No more than 3, actually, but we prefer 1. Tell us the 1 performance bottleneck if you can. And this is from an end user perspective. Back to my my discussion at the beginning of this presentation, I want to know, where is the pain? Where is it being felt? Okay. And then what we want to do is we want to document how that is being felt and how is it being caused. Let's say it's a sales posting, right? So what is the end user doing? Well, what is the data points they're keying into that sales order? Are they setting certain configurations when they go to post? Is it a certain kind of order, certain items, that sort of thing? We want to know all the details of what happens for that end user and what are they doing prior to seeing that effect. Then what we want to do is in a test environment. So we want a copy now of your production environment, and depending on the client, we may be able to do this remotely through an environment on your site, but also what's becoming very popular for us is that we spin up an environment in Azure, and again, just based on a cost pass-through scenario, we spin up an environment, put everything in there so that it's not an extra cost or burden to you. That's also possible. In any case, in this test environment, what we would actually do is we would go in there, install a number of our own tools. All right, these are tools that are very unique to us, and we use them internally. So, and what we would do then is, using these tools, we would develop a set of code that basically, by pushing a button, we can recreate that end user doing their work. So for example, push the button and in code, it creates a sales order, fills it out like the end user, sets all the configurations based on what they told us, and then tries to post it. Okay. And the reason why we do that is when we push that button to say run that process, we actually have some tools that will record how long does it take to go from start to end, but we can also record all of the NAV code that's being executed and how long each line of code takes. So the purpose of this is as you can imagine, because a lot of code can be executed, that's why we want to focus on a very narrow process so that we don't record a whole lot of code. We want to narrow it down. And what we can do is, because we get timing, we can actually isolate the lines of code that take the longest. So once we figure that out, what we then will do is, inside that test environment, is we'll come up with a fix and we'll apply it. And then what we'll do is we'll run that process again. We'll push the button one more time and we'll re-record how long does it take. Then what we want to do is we want to sit back down with your key users and with you, potentially, the client, and do this within 2 to 4 days of when we start, and basically sit down with you and say, okay, great, this is what we've done, this is what we uncovered, this is what we tried to do, and this was our benchmark in terms of what we captured, and this is how we improved it. Maybe, and by improving it, what I mean is we're out to get a percentage gain in time. Right? So if we can say, you know what, we've improved the process by 50%, 100%, 500%. Okay, so for some clients, we've improved it, orders of magnitude of thousands of percent. But it all depends, obviously, on where the nature of the issue is and the kind of problems that we uncover. Right? So at the end of the 2 to 4 day cycle, as we're having this meeting, we can then say, you know what, we've applied this fix. We feel that this is the best that we can do. And I think we're done. Or we might say, you know what, I think we can still gain in some areas if we do A, B, and C, and we recommend that we try these things. Or we might say, you know what, we're done. You gave us one performance bottleneck. Do you have another? Do you want us to look at problem number 2, perhaps? Okay, so these are all possibilities. Oh, and actually there could also be another possibility, which is, and real world example, maybe sometimes clients in customizing their code, like sales posting, sometimes they're doing too much stuff. So for example, I had one client where in a sales posting routine, as they were posting the sales order through, it also recalculated inventory, calculated how much to reorder, would create a purchase order, do a transfer order, do a whole bunch of other things. It was doing like 14 different things on top of the sales posting. So as you can imagine, that added a lot of overhead. So this was a scenario where we recommended that the code be rewritten in such a way that again, from the end user perspective, let's just get that sales posting look like it finished quickly, and maybe mark the sales order in such a way that maybe a process that runs in the background picks it up and actually does the real posting with those other 14 things, so that the end user doesn't have to wait. Back to end user perception, right? So these are all possibilities of what could happen in that discussion, right? So the purpose of these 2 to 4 day cycles is so that at the end of each one of these meetings, you can say to us, yep, great, you know what, I think the recommendations are good. We'll give an approval to continue for another 2 to 4 days, and let's try to see if we can improve performance. Or you might say, you know what, at this point, I think we've reached as much results as we can relative to the budget that we've spent, and at this point we'll say we're done. This gives a control point to you, the client, to be able to say at any point in time, yep, let's continue, or nope, I think we're done. Okay, and I find this works really well. Otherwise, it's very easy, I find, when you're doing performance tuning to have a runaway project and not actually understand where are you performance-wise relative to the money that you've spent. Okay, so hopefully everybody here on the call can understand the value that this provides. Okay, so let me quickly finish up. So we talked about the performance tools. We talked about the analysis tools. So these are reactive tools sold on subscription basis. The perform maintenance tools, ongoing tools that you can embed into your SQL Server jobs to help NAV and SQL Server perform better. Perform tracking, the proactive tools, so that you can get warnings based on KPIs and thresholds. All right. We talked about services. We talked about the performance audit report itself, fixed price. We also talked about the NAV application tuning for more escalated scenarios and one-offs, time and material. Performance workshops, I didn't talk about those. I actually haven't done those in a while, but I used to teach 4-day workshops, hands-on, on NAV and SQL Server performance. And if you can imagine, I can talk for 4 days non-stop about NAV and SQL Server. Should give you a hint as to the amount of complexity involved with some of the relationships between the two products. Right? The other set of tools, we're actually going to have another presentation, I believe, and I'll let Angie talk a little bit about that, I think, after this presentation. But just to quickly call them out, we do have a set of tools which you can also use for the scenario where you have large databases, and what you want to do is you want to slim them down so that potentially they perform better, and you can do better reporting and better maintenance with a smaller database. Just to give you a quick example, we had one client early on, several years ago when we first started providing this tool set to the world. The client was a large, still is, a very large retailer. They had a 1.3 terabyte database, and we helped them slim it down to 800 gigs. And in that case, even though it went down to 800 gigs, completely consistent. So from an NAV perspective, no loss of data. Think of all the flow fields. Think of all the customer balance fields. Think of all the GL balance fields. Everything still works. So I highly recommend, if you're interested in that, I'll let Angie call it the next presentation for that tool set. So at this point, I think I'm done with my presentation. I think I'm 2 minutes over. But at this point, I'm open to some questions. And if we can't get to all questions, I'm more than willing to follow up with anybody who might want more of a one-on-one scenario. Angie?
Well, no questions have come through, but like he said,
Okay.
if you do have any, please send them through so we can get those answered for you.
Well, that takes me to the end of my slide deck, Angie, so it's all up to you now.
All right, well, I just want to thank everyone for attending, and thank you, Floyd, for the presentation. It was very informative. If you would like to come back and join us next week, Floyd's going to continue another webinar on Dynamics NAV Performance Boosters, the tools you didn't even know you were waiting for. So that will be on Wednesday next week, the 19th. And then we do have one more this week, cracking the CRM code, and our Steve Waltz will be presenting on that topic. So if you'd like to be a part of that webinar, please go ahead and register. And we have other webinars coming up for the remainder of the month and the rest of the year. And if you are going to be at any of the conferences coming up, we will be at Directions, just to let you know. And we will also be at Summit in Phoenix. We are booth 529. So we would love for you to come to our booth and meet us, and we would love to meet you and your colleagues who are attending. So we look forward to seeing you at one of the upcoming conferences. And thank you again, everyone, for attending, and we hope to see you on one of our future webinars. Have a great day. Bye.
Thank you.